For years, the works of Japanese game designer Hideo Kojima have amazed the world with their unique blend of story and gameplay. But what has not yet been examined fully is the influence on Kojima's games played by the counterculture of the late 20th century. In this video essay, we'll be looking at how the New Wave era, and specifically Goth subculture and its romantic undertones, influenced this legendary director's games. Let's dive in. Like video games, digital music blossomed in that age of plastic, the 1980s. Computers and other new technology were starting to infiltrate pop culture, kicking off what would be called the information society. It was out of this, and the ashes of what had briefly existed and been known as punk, that a new kind of music and subculture arrived. This was the new wave of pop music. This was the 1980s. For a young Hideo Kojima, important artists in this new pop landscape, first arguably kicked into being by its forefathers Iggy Pop and David Bowie, made their impact. Among them, according to the 1998 official mission handbook for Metal Gear Solid 1, were Ultravox, Sisters of Mercy, Depeche Mode, Nick Cave, and The Cure. All of them listed there as some of Kojima's favorites. But maybe no single new wave band seemingly had as much influence as David Bowie for Kojima, apart from one. New Order, once known with the tragic singer Ian Curtis as Joy Division. From some of his earliest games, Hideo Kojima has paid homage to musical influences like Joy Division and David Bowie. These artists were working at a formative time for the so-called information society, what we now just call the information age. As technology made people's lives easier and more productive, that same technological growth fueled the ongoing arms races and proxy battles of an on-again, off-again, hot and cold Cold War. The West pulled itself from the disastrous ashes of Vietnam only by transforming into a kind of brutal new monster with a pretty plastic anesthetized face. They've called it words like neoliberalism and neoconservatism, but by 1990 the name just became, in the words of President George H. Bush, the New World Order. This new form of modernity would, after the Cold War, become ubiquitous. It was a cold, unforgiving, and barren social atmosphere infamously christened the Age of Plastic, as I said. In the closing of the American century, nothing was real, yet everything was for sale. Inwardly, the world was meaningless, yet outwardly, mass culture adopted the mask of religious ornamentalism. Pop songs began sounding like church choirs, and political and religious leaders became, around the world, more and more difficult to tell apart. It was a bleak world, one besieged by a terrifying pathogen. It had been exacerbated, not unlike the Black Plague in the Dark Ages, by a failed societal response. That virus was AIDS. But other maladies and infectious conditions permeated too, and would fester well into the 1990s. Conditions like greed, fundamentalism, vapidity, and superstition. In short, it was a dark time. One thinker, Umberto Eco, observed in an essay in 1986 that we could call a new kind of Middle Ages. And out of this new Middle Ages, as a comment on it, came the counterculture today we sometimes call Goth. So how has Goth culture influenced Kojima's games? Well, we'd have to begin with 1989's Snatcher. If a major mood image for the post-punk era is weirdos and misfits geeking out over computers dancing, Snatcher is a post-punk game par excellence. Well, it's technically a cyberpunk game. This whole video is going to mire us down in a sort of genre name hell, so forgive me. Cyberpunk is a genre with close connections to many musical movements, and all of this loosely fits under the banner of New Wave. The essential draw of Snatcher is to poke around the decadent postmodern nightscape bespectacled with neon lights and blaster fire. You go clubbing, chase down vampire-like body-snatching bioroids, and solve spooky mysteries. It's the perfect kind of goth-adjacent camp that really defined the best pop culture of its era. But the serious influence of post-punk, goth, and industrial on Kojima's aesthetic would hit a more macabre milestone with the ultra-dark and dank MGS1 in 1998. The big example here is, of course, the character Psycho Mantis. His leather and bondage look is ripped right out of some goth nightclub of the era in Berlin. Meanwhile, Mantis has a backstory that can only rightly be characterized as goth as fuck. But that's just Mantis, one character. The whole game is about confronting the dark side of life, just like to some extent Snatcher was, though in a more humorous tone. Snatcher, for example, often confronted you with grisly, gothy murder scenes. You'd have to power through these uncomfortable moments to find the truth. This theme of coming face to face with our demons and nightmares is not only a big part of all of Hideo Kojima's games, it's the fundamental ethos, you might say, of Goth. In MGS1, Snake has to confront the so-called evil sides to himself and realize the enormous moral weight of simply being alive today, especially heavy for so-called heroes and good guys who fight for the system like him. And vicariously, the player by MGS1 is encouraged to face all the dark selfishness of our own genes, to face the absurdity of our so-called fate in an existential sense, existentialism of course being a major precursor to Goth. Goth, roughly, is a descendant of capital R Romanticism from the 19th century. In somewhat a rejection of modernity and its doctrines that came from the Enlightenment, like reason and objectivity, the Romantics, whether in poetry, architecture, literature, philosophy, or the arts, tended to emphasize a more personal, even spiritual connection with the natural world. The Romantics thought truth was irrelevant without a human being there with a mind to, in the words of Romantic poet William Wordsworth, half perceive what it half creates. Much of this romantic spirit inherent to Goth would find first expression for Kojima perhaps in 2001's Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. In Sons of Liberty, we find a form of speculative sci-fi bordering on magical realism. Fanciful, even impossible things like vampires, psychics, the undead, and super soldiers wind up in the MGS series very commonly. MGS2 introduced the major quasi-romantic postmodern theme of never taking what you hear and see as absolute reality. But MGS2 was goth/romantic in many other ways too. Take one of the gothiest characters in the series that was found in that game, Sons of Liberty's Fortune. This woman fornicates with a bisexual sadistic vampire. Her origin story involves everyone she's ever loved or cared about winding up dead. And now the one thing she wants most, miraculously, she has the power to never get: her own death. Like so many goth-tinged characters in MGS2 and the wider series, Fortune is just waiting for someone to kill her. Characters in MGS tend to be tragic, leather-bound freaks with their own dark eroticism, their own fears and insecurities. They're weird, they're maybe a little twisted, but ultimately they're human beings that we recognize. And in these new dark ages we're living in, they encourage us, as they do, to find faith and meaning wherever we can.
Sad. So sad. A host of sorrows. And you are one of them. I am the sorrow. Like you, I too am filled with sadness. This world is one of sadness. Battle brings death. Death brings sorrow. The living may not hear them. Their voices may fall upon deaf ears. But make no mistake, the dead are not silent. Now you will know the sorrow of those whose lives you have ended.
MGS3 had by far the darkest storyline and theme so far, many of them coinciding with the ideas of goth precursors like Friedrich Nietzsche, or lyrics written by David Bowie and Joy Division's Ian Curtis. Goth and Romanticism tend to question whether we are truly autonomous, rational actors with free will. MGS3 tells us our words and deeds, like MGS2 told us in fact, are all mere byproducts. We are mere metal gears turning in a much larger, darker, scarier machine that Snake Eater calls the times. MGS3 managed to pack in a lot of goth and romantic themes and subtext in a period piece like itself. Prominently here, I think of some of the bosses, the Cobras. One is a sadistic contortionist who specializes in torture via natural poisons, and another, the Fury, dies alongside a goth-as-fuck apparition of a giant screaming head that's pulled right out of 1999's film The Mummy. And if playing this game forcing you to assassinate your own lover mommy wasn't dark and twisted enough, things got really maudlin with 2008's MGS4.
War has changed. ID tag soldiers carry ID tagged weapons, use ID tag gear. Nanomachines inside their bodies enhance and regulate their abilities. Genetic control, information control, emotion control, battlefield control. Everything is monitored and kept under control.
In Guns of the Patriots, we find a truly unique and twisted medley of sex and death, or as Goths might call them, Eros and Thanatos. The game introduced what became the primary subject of focus entering into Kojima's latter stage as a Goth-influenced creator, that subject being death. One crucial forerunner of Goth is the famous romantic tragedy by Mary Shelley, 1818's Frankenstein. Over the years, Snake, our player character throughout MGS, became more and more of a gothic Frankenstein's monster, with MGS4 as perhaps the high point of this monstrous transition. The game again portrayed the modern era in quasi-medieval imagery, as Snake embarks on one final crusade to deliver God's kingdom from the hands and fires of unholy ruin. Religion and religious iconography with MGS4 became central to how the game would talk about its own series, while goth and romantic themes came through clearer and more depressingly than ever through the game's drug-addled and overstimulated gameplay. If you really need to know just how goth MGS4 is, the game has a scene where Snake literally puts a gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger. Fortunately, the gothiness would adopt a little more mystery and vivacious vibrancy with the final run of Metal Gear games, culminating in 2015's Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain. The Phantom Pain and Ground Zeroes were both unbelievably goth, full as they are of demons and venom and scully nightmares and ripped fishnet pantyhose. The MGS5 games made horror and investigation fundamental to the experience of MGS like never before. Draped in hallucinatory red, the Phantom Pain darkly pulsates with hallucinatory verve and terror and awesome demoniac power. It may be one of the gothiest games I've ever played, and in one trailer it even got to use a classic track by that legendary band that had influenced this series all along. The song Elegia from 1985's LP Low Life by the band no longer Joy Division named New Order. And things would only grow gothier and more haunted by death and romanticism with 2019's Death Stranding. All in all, clearly Hideo Kojima is somebody who's been influenced deeply by goth, post-punk romanticism since at least his 20s. Here's to the next spooky masterpiece the Prince of Darkness is no doubt cooking up for us right now. Until next time, boss.
I will hold you and protect you. So let love warm you till the morning. I'll stay.